Hello, it's good to see you all again. We'll be starting the second day of the conference, and it will be opened by Brandon Rhodes, who gave a presentation about I/O yesterday. Today, Brandon will discuss when it's high time to consider using tools that would speed up our development. PyWaw Summit, second day keynote, Brandon Rhodes.
Excuse me while I configure things. It's working. We only need coffee. So let us proceed. Welcome back to the second day. I don't think you'll have heard of J. Elmer Rhodes before. He was my grandfather, a physicist who came up with no new theories. His expertise was in making things work, in studying physical systems. He designed radar apparatuses, early forms of sonar. And when he was old, he sat down and he wrote a series of essays. He would print them out on a dot matrix printer and give them to different members of the family. And after he passed away, I collected these essays together and have them all in one place. One of his essays is about growing up as a little boy in Birmingham, Alabama. And he opens with this statement: education consists of learning specific skills, including how to learn, and also acquiring attitudes. I remember when I went to university, he told me, and this I had never heard anyone say this before, he said, remember, at university you do not take courses, you take professors. His claim was that it doesn't much matter whether you have Dr. Petronas for speaker design or for electronics or for electromagnetics. You need to take one course at least from Dr. Petronas because you need to hear how he thinks and how he solves problems. But whether it's op-amps or whether it's EM equations doesn't much matter because you're almost being exposed to an approach to thinking more than that it's likely you're going to remember all of the details you learn in class. Now, in this early essay, he wrote about his mama. In the house he grew up in, that was the title of he had a grandmother from England. And his English grandmother was called Mama by everyone there in the family in Birmingham. And he says, I was very small when she began to teach me to use tools. And he lists them. Hammer with a cracked handle. A handsaw. I learned years later that it was woefully dull. Monkey wrench, Stilson wrench, screwdriver, and he specifically says that the last of the tools was a dull hatchet. And I thought that this was interesting, that as he remembers, almost at the beginning of his essay about his childhood, he not only remembers all of the tools that Mama taught him how to use, his grandmother, but he remembers that they were, in retrospect, defective, but that he didn't know at the time. And he goes on to another subject, and he doesn't elaborate on this, but I can't help but imagine what frustration there must have been behind the fact that all of these years later, that's what he remembered about this initial set of tools, is that they were dull. I wonder, if your tools are faulty, but you're a little boy and you don't know the difference between a sharp saw and one that is dull, do you simply and always blame yourself for the fact that you can't get work done, for the fact that the hatchet doesn't actually split wood, from the fact that the handsaw won't let you quickly cut through a board. Are your tools dull? How would you know? I ran an amateur astronomy sprint at PyCon 2015, just a month or two ago in Montreal, and helping one of my attendees. He had typed a command line. I sat down to help him. We figured out it was the wrong command line, so I held down backspace to backspace over the line. And the wait for it to reach the beginning of the line, it was just terrible. You held down backspace and it went thump, 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 and I just stopped. I couldn't wait to backspace over the line because it was going to take too long. I realize key repeat rate is a very personal decision. Under any normal circumstances, I would not question how somebody else's MacBook Air is configured. That's very personal. I believe previously I've only ever dared to go set that setting for people I'm dating. It's not something I normally question. But this was just too extreme a situation. We had a lot to get done. He was only going to be able to be at the sprint for one day. I wanted to be able to move very quickly. So I asked permission. I said, could I open your system settings? And just for today, because I'll be at your keyboard so much, can I adjust your key repeat rate? And his answer was, what's the key repeat rate? It turns out he had never said it. And so I went into the keyboard and I did what I always do when I have to use someone else's MacBook Air. Key repeat rate all the way up, delay all the way down. Just for good measure, I went in and put the tracking speed all the way at the top. I decided that rather than be frustrated with the tool I was having to use, I would just go ahead and fix it so that I could take a deep breath and without distraction go on to help him get this astronomy tool set up. I wound up, since it had gone so well with the first person, I did it to every Mac, every computer around the table that I had to touch. I just asked permission and then pegged all of those settings. Within 20 minutes, all of them had adjusted, and to my surprise, no one at the end of the day asked for their computer to be slow again. And in fact, that first sprinter thanked me for making his computer so fast. I wonder for how many years they had been waiting while the backspace key slowly eliminated a line that they wanted to retype without knowing that that's a setting, that that tool can be sharpened and improved and made more effective. I hope that they had a very good time with the astronomy tools they worked with in the sprint, but I'll bet this is the most valuable thing I did for them. They might, a few days of each year, get a chance to go play with the astronomy tools some more, but I'll bet they'll be happy that their tracking speed lets them fly around the screen every day that they use the MacBook Air. And so the result, to my surprise, was a win when I, instead of just focusing on what the sprint was supposed to be about, the software, the code, I instead made a part of the sprint trying to get everyone well configured, set up with an editor that worked, a keyboard that worked well, and I actually feel that the sprinters came away with a lot more value from the settings that I helped them establish than from their experience for a few hours with the particular piece of astronomy code. I developed a hypothesis. Many novice programmers, I think, have no gauge on whether their tools are wasting their time, because your computer doesn't have a light that lights up and warns you you're wasting time right now. You need to switch a setting. You need to change editors. You need to learn your shell better. And that, I think, is why events like this summit are so important. It's why, even for those of us who are remote workers, it's important to sometimes be with our coworkers, to attend conferences, to do pair programming, to watch screencasts so that you can spy on how somebody else uses their desktop. I know that the official reason for pair programming is supposed to be that the code is better because you're both watching, and for people that pair program in a work environment all the time, that's most of what they get out of it. But I find that in the first hour of using a computer with someone, you hardly notice the code because their work processes are so different. They open their editor and something happens and you're like, wait, that takes me a minute. How did you do that? And by watching someone else use their tools, you can often come to learn possibilities that you didn't even know existed. Things that I remember were big moments as I began to learn my desktop and my tooling was how quickly and accurately could I switch windows. I've used several systems over the years. I like to just be able to think editor, shell. My decision is my configuration here is rather quirky. I use what is called auto raise, and where if the mouse enters an application, and if I stay there for more than 0.2 seconds, then the system just brings it right to the top. So all I have to do is just kind of think, well, I want my editor, browser, xterm, editor, xterm. Did you notice I just changed orders and it didn't matter? I just kind of knew what direction of the screen I wanted to go to, and a moment there it was there. Compare that to, I don't know if you've ever sat behind your friend while they try to use Alt-Tab to move between applications. That's one of those n=2 solutions. Alt-Tab is great as long as you're just moving between two apps, but have you ever seen someone start to move between 3 or 4 windows with Alt-Tab, and often it just becomes probabilistic. They just start hitting Alt-Tab a certain number of times and letting go to see what comes up. It's a very frustrating process to watch. It's much more comfortable to watch people who bind hotkeys that will bring up instantly exactly the app they want, or to someone like me who does it spatially. I might overshoot sometimes, but I never wind up in that loop of trying to figure out how many Alt-Tabs will bring up the app I'm thinking of. Can you indent and dedent code without having to separately adjust each line? Do you ever find yourself doing this? Or have you gone into your editor settings and found out how to do indentation and dedentation as a built-in command? Even the little idle IDE built into Python has a shortcut for indentation and dedentation. Does your editor run PyFlakes or a similar tool and flag errors before you even run the code? If you're up at the top of a file and you say os.walk, does it light that up and tell you undefined name OS is going to happen when you run this code because you've forgotten the import statement? If you say a=10 print b, does it both light up the A line, does it light up the A line because you're defining something you're not using? Does it light up the B line because it doesn't see that B is defined anywhere? It has cut, I think, my normal scripting time in half to have it tell me when I've misspelled a variable right in the editor, rather than having to do the round trip to coming over to the terminal, running the program, and then stepping back. Can you automate repetitive editing tasks with things like macros or multiple cursors? If I come down here and I want to change these old-fashioned % signs to modern .format methods, the old-fashioned way of doing this in Emacs is to say, all right, Emacs, memorize this. Search for %. Let's get rid of it and type the curly braces. Let's put .format and parens both where I'm at and at the end of the line. Done. I now have a macro set up that if I move to another line and run it again, it just acts like I've just typed all of those keys all over again for that line. That's kind of an old-fashioned programmer's way of thinking about it, setting essentially up a little program that I can run in my editor. The more modern way, copied, I believe, from Sublime Text, is to let me just have multiple cursors so that I can come here, change this back to %s, and have the line restored. For many people, that's more natural because all of the lines change simultaneously, and you can see what effect your keystrokes are having over the whole data set. That is something that I added only very recently to my tool set, and it's been a big win. And of course, do you use version control? Do you know how to use the tab key for not only navigation, where you can move between fields in a web page you're filling out, a form that you're filling out, but do you use tabs for completion? I remember having had to watch people before who have typed whole file names without ever hitting tab. They type user local bin Python 2.7 site pack, and they don't hit tab. And so they don't know when they reach the end of the line whether that's even a thing. It's not, but now you're starting over from square one. If you use tab completion, one, you have to type less because you hit U tab, and it does the rest of it for you. But the real advantage is that when you type this, you realize that you meant lib Python 2.7 site packages, and that you get told immediately in the middle of the line where you're making the mistake, that you can go ahead and correct it. So it's neat. You never wind up hitting enter until you already have confirmed that a file exists. And then finally, do you know the most important 8 keystrokes for editing with readline? Readline is the library that lets you use control and just a few easy-to-remember characters to edit lines in Bash, in ZSH, in Emacs, and it's what is supported by default in Python when you bring up its command line. They are mnemonic. They aren't on the keyboard by position, but by, unfortunately, English words. P and N, control P and N, are previous and next line. B and F are back and forward a character if you use control, but the superpower is that Alt moves you an entire word at the time. And then the end of the line, naturally enough, is control E. They'd already used B for back, so they decided that A, the first letter in the alphabet, would represent the beginning of the line. And once you know those keystrokes, I can control P to go up here, and I'd normally find myself zooming back and forth with the Alt forward and back. It just, even with my key repeat rate set pretty high, it just, look at that, it's so slow. It takes way too long to wait for a character at a time motion. What I do instead is I do word at a time motion, because then it's very easy to move back and forth. Change this to Python 3.4, only that's apparently not there. Oh, thank you, Ubuntu, for coming up with your own special names for everything. Tab completion. I discovered it was there anyway, because with tab completion, you never have to guess. But these keystrokes, if you just learn previous, next, back, forward, beginning, end, you'll find that in a lot of situations it becomes easier to, let's say that I run the unit tests of my little logging tree module, and because I added that call to walk, we now have a failure. Okay, very often after running the tests under, let's say, Python 2, I now want to run under Python 3. A moves me to the beginning of the line, move one word forward, will get me right to where I need to go if I want to edit that specific part of the line. Whether you use this system or another, try to find a set of tools where you can just very quickly jump to the part of a line you want. And the last thing I'll mention that was just a part of basically booting up as I began to learn how to effectively get my machine to do immediately what I needed next was interactive search. There are some, even today, very, very terrible and broken search fields in the sense that they make you type a whole word or phrase and they don't say anything, they don't give you any help, they just wait for you to hit enter, And only then do you find out whether what you're typing matches anything on the page. If you've done searching recently within a browser, you've probably noticed that, like Google Chrome, I believe, now as you type starts to light up. If I do L-O-G, everything on the page that matches it is highlighted, so I can see immediately if I type a wrong character that, oh, I typed the wrong character, nothing's lit up, and I can back up and, again, correct myself in the middle of my typing rather than at the end of an error. And at the command line, there's also Control-R for reverse search. I could just Control-R3, Enter, and I've just run the command, rerun the most recent command line that had a 3 in it. If I find that as I type commands, I'm often looking for what unique character occurs in each command so that Control-R can jump me right back to a command I want to repeat without hitting up arrow and reading each of them separately. Watching a skilled programmer use basic tools can help you learn which operations are supposed to be simple and what's supposed to be hard. What kind of things are always going to be challenging, and it's okay if you burn several seconds or several minutes or several hours working on that task. It was a great fun a few years ago to get to spend an afternoon with Carl Meyer. I was visiting Elkhart, Indiana, where he lived at the time. We got together, and I thought we would just talk about Django and development and some code we were interested in. But as soon as I saw him start doing stuff on his screen, instead I got a 2-hour lesson in how Carl Meyer's laptop is set up, and I went home and installed a half-dozen tools I'd never even known existed. It can be great fun to sit alongside someone and ask them how they're accomplishing things so quickly and effectively. There's a character in Tolstoy named Levin, and it says in the novel that being made very angry by the bailiff, he had recourse to his favorite means for regaining his temper. He took a scythe from a peasant and began mowing. A scythe, of course, being a long blade, very long, I'm told, in peasant Russia, attached to a handle that in the age before machinery you use to cut the grass or the hay in a field. Peasants would traditionally do this in groups. You would get in kind of a staggered line and all be doing adjacent rows as you scythed a field together. It says in Tolstoy that Levin felt, as he swung his scythe, they're getting near the end of the row, that he was at the very end of his strength. But at that very moment, the peasant stopped of his own accord. Levin was afraid he wouldn't be able to catch up, but the peasant stops and, stooping down, picked up some grass, rubbed his scythe, and began wetting it. Having done a single row of the field, the scythe is now useless for the second row until the scythe has been attended to. It needs to be sharpened, the field of the width they're doing in this book, it needs to be sharpened every time you get to the end of the field. I have rarely ever sharpened a tool that often, but when you're an expert in a tool, you very often apparently learn that it's just better every half hour to stop and sharpen rather than continuing to use it while it gets more and more dull. I love, by the way, how you can kind of tell when you're getting, when you're talking about technologies and activities that were important to ancient Saxons, because English reverts down to single-syllable words. You can tell that this must have been a very important set of subjects, because in the same way that all the important people seem to get the 3-letter names on Twitter, and the single-letter names on Twitter, concepts like mow and scythe and wet were assigned those comparatively rare single-syllable words in English because of how important those activities are. The lesson, I think, of that passage in Tolstoy is that you will not mow effectively if you pay attention only to the work you're doing, the grass. Mowing a field involves alternating your attention between the grass, the work you're doing, and the scythe, and the tool. Both of them need regular attention if you're going to make good progress. And I think this is a good image of the fact that all work involves a rhythm, a balance between focus on the work and a focus on your tools. Do you build into every week an hour, 2 hours? Do you build into your schedule an expectation that you'll sometimes stop and play with your editor's configuration, or go look up whether there's a plugin that could automate something you're doing in the browser? Do you, like those peasants, go ahead and schedule time to make sure your tools stay adequate to the work that you're doing? That brings up a question. When is it time to switch focus? I mean, we have a lot of grass to cut. How can we stop for a moment? When is it time to switch focus and think about tools? One famous moment came when Donald Knuth, a famous computer scientist, he looked back at the early editions of the Transactions of the American Mathematical Society. They were beautiful. If you look at the variables, they fit perfectly into the paragraph of text that they're part of. This is what was coming out of the AMS by the time he was around in 1974. I mean, look at that next to the last line. Polydisk in, and then the sentence just pauses for a while, leaving this big blank space before the little letter N appears. In fact, every time you can see that it flips from text to math or back, there are these huge inexplicable gaps created by the fairly poor modern typographic techniques that were being used in the 70s. And Donald Knuth writes this, that at this point, I regretfully stopped submitting papers to the American Mathematical Society, since the finished product was just too painful for me to look at. In one of the more epic examples of stopping to sharpen your scythe, Donald Knuth took a year off from publishing as a mathematician to create a new language for writing fonts, to then use that to design his own typefaces, and then invent a new typesetting language that would do beautiful mathematics of the kind that used to be done by hand in the 1920s. He figured that it was just better to spend a year writing a new document processing system. He decided that was a better use of his time than to try to get good results out of the tools that were already there. Another famous example, of course, is Python itself. Here's a quote from Guido's History of Python, Part 1, series of blog posts he did recently. I realized that the development of system administration utilities, this was in the Netherlands, in C was taking too long. This might seem incredible to you, that stopping to invent your own programming language might save you time. If that's so, you've never used C. He stopped and invented a programming language because he knew that he would get the programs written, say this correctly, he knew that the programs he needed to write would be done faster if he invented a new programming language, then wrote them, than if he tried to write them in the tools he had already. Python saved time. It eliminated repetitive tasks like handwritten memory allocation without suffering from all of the WATs of traditional scripting languages. Traditional scripting languages have absolutely insane type systems. I have an example here, because this is actually in the browser. So let me bring up my JavaScript console. I will allow myself one tiny example here. So, of course, we can add numbers together, but what happens if you have a string and a number? C or Java would just give you an error. For whatever reason, traditional scripting languages earned a deservedly bad reputation for the fact that if you do something that makes no sense, then they decide to go ahead and do something nonsensical at runtime. rather than giving you anything useful like an error. So what is the string 40 minus 30? Well, of course, it's the number 10. So what is the string 40 plus 30? That, of course, is the string 4030. What? Gary Bernhardt has a wonderful talk that I saw called WAT, where he takes Ruby and JavaScript and some other modern languages and just shows you all the different situations where they surprise you. Python was a very interesting design. It gave you the flexibility of a scripting language. You don't have to declare variables, you just use them, combined with the strong type system of something like C or Java. So it was a combination people hadn't seen before, a very flexible language, but that stops and gives you a type error if you do something unreasonable rather than just guessing. Programmer productivity in Python tends to be very high because, after all, what is the essential measure of our productivity? I would argue that it is measured in inverse watts per hour. Because every time you run into a watt, you're just stopped. You get an output from your program that you don't understand, didn't predict, and you're now stopped until you dig back and find out what happened. Remember yesterday's talk about going down the rabbit hole. Those were watt moments where you just don't understand what's going on. I have a personal theory. I will say that Ola's experiences with Django Forms were not perhaps entirely unique. I, at one time, I think Django Forms might be watts all the way down. So, the experts do epic things. They stop and invent typesetting systems and languages to speed themselves up. Those are expert moves. What about the rest of us? What I've found to be very useful is to put my home directory under version control, and though I might not invent my own programming language or my own typesetting system, I can begin to collect a set of my own commands. I check them into version control, so when this laptop dies and I get another one, my home directory and its files come back. And that way I have a sort of tradition that moves from one machine to the other of quick little maneuvers and utilities that help me be effective at the command line. I did used to have the problem of discovery. I would think, okay, I know I have something that hooks me up to a projector. Was it called projector? No. And of course, the problem is if you type like P in tab, then you get 523 different possibilities because most of those commands are the ones in the system directory. And I thought, well, what if all of my commands started with a really rare character so that tab completion wouldn't bring up all of Ubuntu's commands? I did an exhaustive search. The shell has managed to claim almost every piece of punctuation on the keyboard as special. $, exclamation point, but they forgot about the comma. And so, if you look in my bin directory that in version control travels from one machine to the other with me, all of my personal commands start with commas so that when I'm thinking, what is the name of that command? I just hit comma tab, and there's the list of all my commands, and I can see that it's called VGA. You might think it would be annoying in your home directory to have it be a Git branch because then you might forget and run Git commands in your home directory that in fact you meant to apply to another project. So what I do is I have a command called home that whenever I run it, if it sees that I have my little Git directory sitting there, it moves it out of the way to another name. So most of the day I run with version control turned off in my home directory. I can't accidentally run git check in there thinking that I'm out in one of my projects. But when I want to edit a .dot file, I can turn it on, make the change, and then turn it back off again. Those are the kind of little habits that you can build for yourself if you have some way to carry your little shell scripts, your little utilities from one place to another. Watch demonstrations. I'd heard of the IPython notebook, but it was seeing Fernando's 2013 PyCon Canada keynote that made me run home and use it. When I saw someone not only showing me that I could run Python code that evaluates to a value or prints to the screen, not only that I could very easily make multiple lines of code that defined and ran functions, but he demonstrated that you could set up whole ranges of numbers and write in line, create graphs. This was great for loading up Apache log files and on the fly writing little functions to filter them and show me different things. It was very, very easy, having loaded up some data, to over and over and over rebuild a graph, adding captions, moving things around, changing colors, that in my old toolkit, I would have had to have this in a Python script that ran over again from the beginning, re-examining all those log files every time I wanted to change the spelling of something in the title. Fernando showed how, if you mark a cell as a text cell, you can write Markdown. You can even write Donald Knuth's little mathematical typesetting commands that he invented in the 1970s. And when you execute a text cell, it formats it using publication quality typesetting decisions as regards the math. And this means that you can make either a science paper or a blog post an executable file that you can rerun when you want to make sure it produces the right output. Finally, I didn't know that he showed us how, by using an exclamation point, you can run shell commands from right in the notebook. By using equals exclamation point, you can run a shell command and assign the output lines back to a Python list. And then finally, you can even have entire cells that are written in another language, like R or Ruby or Perl or a number of other languages that now work with the ecosystem. I had to see someone use this. I had to see someone demonstrate this for it to move from being a list of features, I'd seen people tweet about it, I knew it was there, to realizing that this would have a really important place in my tool set. Most novice programmers, I think, based on watching them, on teaching them, on helping them, hack away slowly at their work, typically with very dull tools. But could there be an equal and opposite error? This surprised me, and I didn't think about this initially. Dr. Dan Rocco, recently when I was discussing this issue with him, showed me the book, The 7 Essentials of Woodworking. The author says this, of American woodworkers in particular: too many woodworkers tinker and experiment with tools and avoid applying their skills in the real world. Apparently, thousands of, for some reason, woodworkers in the United States have a gleaming, expensive table saw and the fanciest new battery-powered drill, the best set of chisels, boutique veneers and stains for their wood, and never actually get around to building anything. I guess it's like someone that owns a sports car but never takes it out on the track. It is possible to avoid, the author here suggests that it's scary to build furniture, to make things with wood. It makes you vulnerable. People are going to look at it and tell you whether it looks any good. When you try to assemble it, you're going to learn whether you measured correctly. It's a frightening thing to actually try building something and see if it works. It's far more comfortable to simply have very expensive tools and to look at them gleam when your friends come over. And when Dr. Rocco described this problem that woodworkers have, I realized that I'd done it myself in computers. I remember the very first project I had as a researcher at Georgia Tech, a career that did not last very long. I spent almost all of my time setting up and configuring my new Red Hat Linux desktop workstation that I'd had them buy for me. And thus got in almost late and not very well researched the report that I was supposed to write. And I think I did that because it was emotionally much safer for me to fiddle with tools than to actually accomplish anything with them. I've done that exact same thing that woodworkers do, but with computers. Can you pass the salt? I said, I know, I'm developing a system to pass you arbitrary condiments. It's been 20 minutes. It'll save time in the long run. There's always this danger of thinking that you need to improve something, write something, build a tool, when maybe it's not the best decision, when maybe it won't be effective. What should govern the question of investment in tools that we make with our time? The two things that I look for are I try to let these two needs drive me towards new tools. Looking out for repetition when I'm having to do something by hand, and something I'll explain called traction. Repetition, it's sort of a programmer, JIT thyself. A JIT, a JITted runtime, or just-in-time compiler, is a language runtime, like a PyPy, that's able to get bored. PyPy will sit and interpret your Python code until it notices that you've run a loop 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, and then it will stop. And it will say, wait, are you really going to ask me to run this for 101st time? Then wait. And it goes over and it compiles that routine to assembly language before coming back. In the same way, we can become sensitive to repetition. I've seen very sad cases where there were people who weren't sensitive to repetition. They would once they were just so excited that they had figured out that, okay, if I go to this menu and pull down and go here and cut this and move this and do this, I'll have accomplished one of these things. And so they just start going through that over and over and apparently lack that warning buzzer in the back of their head that should tell them this is becoming very expensive and eating up an hour of their day. JIT yourself. Have some part of you that will stop and ask, well, wait a minute, is this a task I'm now doing often enough that I should automate it? Boredom is a key skill for the modern programmer. All right, my idea of traction is that, what's the point of my tools? The point is to cut the grass, is to make progress. So as long as I feel the wheels are still gripping and I'm still moving forward, I just keep coding. If it feels like I'm flailing and sort of just starting to make random changes and don't understand things, then I stop to work on my tools. I try to use the question of, am I making progress, govern whether I take a break to start sharpening. But that can be dangerous. Traction can be dangerous because I've noticed it can pull me away from something I should be doing towards less important problems. I won't say whether this is true or not, but it's possible that last week at work, instead of spending most of my time on what I should have been working on, it's possible that I spent a lot of my time on a less important problem, but one that I knew how to solve. The fact that I could feel I had traction there pulled me in that direction because I don't know, it's emotionally easier to do something that we know we can succeed at, where we feel every 10 or 20 minutes like we've knocked down another problem and are making progress. The fact that one problem I have a lot of traction on and my tools work there can pull me in the wrong direction. You can, as a solution to that, simply fight your emotions and throw yourself at the problem that's harder. But I often find I work better if when I notice that I'm being pulled in one direction because I just don't have the tooling to even know how to approach another problem, is to turn to the tools, to turn to the sharpening, and begin to see whether I can put together a winning set of tools that will give me traction on that harder problem that I'm avoiding. Practice, before you hit really big problems, practice creating traction so that you decide the direction you're going. Whenever you've hit a problem during the day that's a little tough, stop and think about whether learning a debugger, learning a new feature of your debugger might make it easier so that you decide the direction you go in, instead of your tools and fears setting the direction for you. Paying attention to repeated tasks, paying attention to whether I'm effective, has led me, this isn't a process that I, that ever finishes. I recently have adopted a number of tools paying attention to these things. I used to go to the web to look up all the string methods. It had not occurred to me until within the last few months that instead of waiting for that big web page to load that has on it the string methods and the dictionary methods, and like it's impossible to find. Anyone ever gone to the standard, you look up string methods, you're given a page with the string methods hidden somewhere in the very middle. I didn't know I could just say PyDoc string and there they are. I didn't think about the fact I can just say exceptions. And even if I'm on a plane flight with no connectivity, there's the exception hierarchy. I'd always known something called PyDoc got installed, but I'd never known that it could save me minutes a day and hours over my year by letting me instantly get up documentation. Jedi, so that when I'm sitting here, if I want to go see the OS module, I just say go visit it, and Jedi will leap there automatically, and then I can pop back out and be right back where I was. Get a good searching tool and learn how to use it. AG, the Silver Searcher, is my favorite. I recommend you look into it. And then, for years, my Emacs friends had told me about Magit and the ability to ask your version control for what's going on right in Emacs. And it was not until I went to Dropbox and was facing a much larger code base than I had before that all of a sudden this went from being a rumor to a big win. Again, I didn't let myself get into the trap of just going and adding all of the tools immediately as soon as I heard rumor of them. I tried to let the work I was doing drive me to the tool when the time was right. What'll I be doing next? Hillary Mason just tweeted about a font I'm going to try out, just looking into the future of my tooling. Ligatures are when a font can get two adjacent characters, and when it recognizes they're adjacent, it can flip to another way of representing them, used so like that a double F in traditional printing becomes that single character double F. And look at the true does not equal false. The ligatures in this font substitute a real not equal sign whenever it sees us type the programmer version of that. And people are reporting it's a lot easier to read some languages' code. So I'll try it out. Setting up your tooling is a lifelong process. It can take months or years to notice a pattern and learn how to automate it away. I mean, often I just feel so dumb when I finally figure out I can use PyDoc. For more than a decade, I just always went to Google, and if the internet was working, waited for that result to come up. It's staggering how many probably 100 or more hours were wasted over the years. But that's how I work. I let inefficiency, that feeling of repetition, drive me to solutions. So, what then is the most important instrument to keep sharp? Yourself. In Ola's talk yesterday, notice how she focused on you as an instrument, on you as a tool that grows dull over the hours. She asked, are you hungry, thirsty? Set a timer, plan a break. I can't tell you how many times I've been writing an email. Notice that I'm not being terribly kind in the email, and then notice that I'm thirsty, I'm hot, I'm tired, I'm annoyed, and I've had to go fix that first before I can come back and use my other tools effectively. Self-awareness is important, not just whether the scythe is sharp, but whether you're working effectively. You don't merely need to be aware of your tools. You need to be aware of yourself. Notice that that's actually the point of the passage I quoted from Tolstoy. I'll repeat that first sentence. Being made very angry by the bailiff, Laban had recourse to his favorite means for regaining his temper. He took a scythe from a peasant and began mowing. The passage, though it does involve a peasant sharpening a scythe, it's also about Laban working on himself and making himself a more effective tool. Remember what drew my attention to the key repeat rate at the sprint? It was my frustration. I've tried to learn to have a little part of my mind always kind of watching when I get frustrated that says, you know, I can either spend this sprint frustrated and short-tempered and waiting on everybody's keyboards, and that can be how I experience today. Or, the moment I noticed frustration, I took my finger off the backspace key. And I thought, hey, let's go to that little apple. Let's bring up the system settings. Let's sharpen a tool. Thank you very much.